In 1950, a young American intelligence officer found a weapon more effective than any bullet, a fear so deep it organized entire villages, changed how people built their homes, and made mothers sleep with a knife under the pillow, not for burglars, but for something that could reach through a bamboo floor with a tongue as thin as thread, find a sleeping woman's womb, and take the child inside her without waking her. To understand how one officer turned that fear into a weapon that won a war without firing a shot, you first have to understand the thing itself. The compass swings east across the Pacific and stops on 7,000 islands. Pin dropped. The Philippines. Say Aswang today, and most people picture one thing: a woman who splits at the waist, her upper half sprouting wings and flying off into the night, trailing her own intestines like a kite string. That creature, the Manananggal, is real, as folklore. But it's only one face of something much older and much stranger. Before the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, Aswang wasn't the name of a single monster. It was a category, an umbrella term, for a whole class of night things that fed on the living or the dead. Shapeshifters, corpse-eaters, blood drinkers, things that hunted specifically at childbirth, when a mother and infant were both most vulnerable. Which regional version you feared depended on which island you lived on. The earliest written record of the word is older than most people guess. In 1589, the Spanish friar Juan de Plasencia catalogued it in his Customs of the Tagalogs, describing the Aswang as an eighth class of person, a sorcerer who left the body at night to devour the living, shifting shape to avoid being caught. And that's where the colonial history gets uncomfortable. When Spanish friars arrived, they found something they hadn't expected. Female spiritual leaders called Babaylan, the people who ran the village's spiritual life, who healed the sick and led rituals, often with more real authority than any man in the village. The friars needed that authority gone, so the Babaylan didn't get compared to a doctor or a priestess. They got compared to a monster, Aswang. Filipino historian Augusto de Viana and others have traced the pattern directly. Colonial-era accounts recast Babaylan's spiritual authority as monstrous, folding real women into the same category as the Aswang they were supposedly protecting people from. Though, how deliberate that reframing is still debated among historians, not a settled fact. A woman who cures your child one day and might be blamed for eating the next child that dies is a woman nobody trusts enough to follow. That's the real function of the belief, underneath the folklore, an explanation for what colonial-era medicine couldn't explain. Miscarriage, infant death, a fever that took a child in a single night. Somebody had to be responsible, and it was safer psychologically and politically for that somebody to be a monster than a disease nobody understood. Which meant, in practice, that it was sometimes a person, a midwife, a widow, someone who lived alone at the edge of the barrio. The belief didn't stay folklore. In 1997, the Philippine Supreme Court upheld convictions from a case in Isulan, Sultan Kudarat, where several men shot 4 farmers at close range, telling them they were being killed because they were Aswang. 3 died. That's not folklore. That's a court record. The Manananggal specifically comes with its own documented countermeasure, and it tells you exactly how the folklore was meant to function. When she detaches at the waist to fly and hunt, her lower half stays behind, standing upright wherever she left it, waiting for her return before dawn. Find that lower half first, folklore says, and rub it with garlic or ash or salt, and when the upper half comes back, the 2 halves can't rejoin. She's stranded, and sunrise kills what the mismatch didn't. It's not a jump scare detail. It's a whole piece of applied folk logic. The monster has a weakness, the weakness is specific, and the community passed that specific knowledge down because they believed they might actually need it. And this fear had furniture. Real households kept garlic hung by the door, salt scattered across windowsills, and the most distinctly Filipino defense of all, the whip-like tail of a stingray, called buntot pagi, kept by the entrance specifically to strike an aswang that got too close. These weren't superstition performed for show. families structured their actual homes around a threat they treated as certain. And one province built its entire modern identity on it. Capiz, on the island of Panay, is still called the Aswang capital of the Philippines. Today, a stereotype persistent enough that in 2025, the local government itself was publicly criticized for leaning into an Aswang capital parade float, reigniting a decades-old fight over whether the region should be known for that or for its actual biggest export, seafood. And the belief didn't stop working as a weapon once the Spanish left, either. Different rulers, same trick. A 2019 documentary called Aswang, directed by Alex Arumpak, same name, deliberately followed the first 2 years of the Philippine government's war on drugs under President Duterte and found vigilantes and police using the exact same language on human targets. Suspected addicts described as monsters, bodies left as warnings, a 500-year-old fear retooled for a modern purge. The Aswang was never just a monster. It was always also a tool for deciding, quietly and without a trial, who counted as human. Here's the split frame. What the movies gave you and what the folklore actually says. Hollywood's version. One creature, usually a beautiful woman, who transforms at night, flies on bat-like wings, and hunts for blood, practically a Filipino reskin of the European vampire. The Philippines even claims the first Filipino sound horror film was built around this legend 1933's. Ang Aswang and the glamorous single transformation archetype has barely changed since Right Up, through Netflix's Tress in 2021, which introduced the Manananggal specifically to a global audience that had never heard the word before. The real folklore version, Aswang was never one creature. It was a taxonomy of fears, and each region built its own monster to match. The Manananggal severs at the torso and flies. The tick-tick hunts by sound, and the sound lies to you. The louder the bird call, the farther away it is. The fainter it gets, the closer it's already come. The whack-whack works the same trick under a different name, a province over. The ungo haunts burial grounds specifically, feeding on the freshly dead before a family can finish mourning them. None of them look like a horror movie pin-up. They look like whatever a frightened community needed to explain the unexplainable shape-shifting. Specifically so the monster could be your neighbor, and you'd never know until it was too late. Even the franchise built on top of this, the annual Shake, Rattle and Roll horror anthology, running since 1984, mostly reaches for the same single glamorous transformation. Film after film, because that's the version that sells. It's not wrong exactly. It's just the tip of a much larger, much older taxonomy of fear, filed down to one marketable shape. That's the real horror Hollywood filed the edges off of, not a sexy vampire. A fear so useful it could be pointed at anyone. Tiyanak. Picture a baby, abandoned in the forest, crying. You pick it up to save it. Its face changes in your arms. The Tiyanak is a demon that wears the shape of an infant, specifically to weaponize kindness, and folklorists connect it directly to the same unexplained infant death grief that shaped the Aswang myth. Some tellings go further. It's the spirit of an unbaptized or aborted child, unable to move on, turned monstrous by exactly the grief that should have made it sympathetic. Same wound, different mask. That's a full episode on its own. But if the Tiyanak is small enough to fit in your arms, the next one is big enough that you'd never see all of it at once. Kapre. A giant, dark-skinned tree spirit who smokes enormous hand-rolled cigars from the branches of old balit trees and who is territorial rather than evil as long as you respect his tree. Loggers who cleared old-growth forest reported disappearances for generations, and some Filipino families still won't build near a baleti tree without first asking permission out loud. Just in case something's listening, whether you believe the Kapre took them or you believe the forest itself did, the folklore and the deforestation timeline line up in a way worth its own dig. But if the Kapre is a giant you could theoretically see coming, the next one you'll never catch looking, because it's the reason the path home stopped making sense. Tikbalang. A trickster with the head of a horse and the body of a man, who leads travelers in circles on forest paths at night, until they're hopelessly lost, sometimes for days. Walking in a loop, they'd swear, was a straight line. The traditional countermeasure is real, still practiced by some. Turn your shirt inside out. And the Tikbalang's hold on you supposedly breaks the same logic as the Manananggal's weakness, a monster that can be outthought if you know the trick. A monster with a documented folk remedy is a monster worth its own episode. But if the Tikbalang gets you lost outdoors, the next one gets in through a gap in your own house because someone kept it as a pet. Sigbin, a goat-like creature that walks backward, said to be kept on a leash by witches Mangkukulam, and used to hunt blood at night while its owner sleeps, small enough to slip through gaps a person never could, which is exactly why it was blamed for deaths inside homes that showed no sign of forced entry. The Sigbin isn't just a monster story. It's tangled up in the real, documented persecution of folk healers accused of witchcraft across the Visayas. That's not folklore. That's a court record waiting to be found. And if the Sigbin is something a witch keeps, the last one on this list is proof that some things refuse to be kept at all, even by death. Amalanhig. Not a ghost. A corpse that refuses to finish dying, reanimated, aware, and stuck in the process of decay, unable to rest until it bites someone else and passes the curse along, the same way it was passed to them. It remembers being a person. It remembers its own family, which folklore holds is exactly why it comes home first. Families in some regions still bury their dead with the knees bent. Folklore holds, specifically so a returning Amalanhig can't walk. A monster whose own folklore comes with funeral instructions is a monster with a story bigger than one episode can hold. In 1950, the Philippine government was fighting a communist insurgency, the Hukbalahap, or Hook, guerrillas in the jungles of Luzon. Advising that fight was a young American Air Force officer named Edward Lansdale, who would go on to become one of the most influential psychological warfare strategists of the Cold War. Lansdale had read the same thing you just heard, that entire communities organized their lives around the fear of the Aswang, the garlic by the door, the stingray tail at the threshold, the houses built without gaps for a reason. He didn't need to invent a new fear. He just needed to aim the one that was already there. So when Philippine forces located a Hook patrol route through Aswang-believing territory, Lansdale didn't send more soldiers. He had his men ambush a lone Hook guerrilla, kill him, and puncture 2 holes in his neck vampire bite marks before draining the body and leaving it on the trail for the next patrol to find. The Hook found the body. They didn't call for reinforcements. They didn't investigate. They retreated from the entire area, convinced an Aswang was hunting them on its own ground. No firefight. No casualties on the government side. A monster that isn't real won a stretch of jungle that very real soldiers couldn't take. Lansdale documented the operation himself in his 1972 memoir, In the Midst of Wars, An American's Mission to Southeast Asia. And it became a founding case study in modern psychological warfare cited, taught, and repeated in military doctrine for decades after the jungle. It happened in Stopped Mattering to Anyone. Worth saying plainly, this account comes from Lansdale's own telling, not an independently corroborated record, a documented, single-sourced military anecdote, the kind that becomes doctrine because it's useful, whether or not every detail happened exactly as written. The tactic outlived the war. The insurgents it was used against are a footnote now. The trick find what a population already fears and become that instead of fighting them is still standard doctrine, just with better technology and no need for an actual folklore anymore. That's the belief turned real moment this whole series is built to find. Not a monster, a fear, real enough that a spy could aim it like a rifle. Every countermeasure you heard in this episode, the garlic, the stingray tail, the shirt turned inside out, the knees bent in the grave, was somebody's genuine attempt to survive something they believed was hunting them. Lansdale didn't invent that belief. He just found it lying there, already loaded, and pulled the trigger. And if a single officer could turn one legend into a weapon that won ground without a single shot fired, imagine what happens when an entire empire builds its power on a legend instead of just borrowing one. That's Romania. That's next.